This is what baseball looked like in 1960. And this is what baseball looked like in 1995. So why did I show you that? Because that's how long it took for APBA to make significant changes to its basic baseball game boards. That's right, for about 35 years, the boards were more or less the same, with only a few very minor and very easy to remember changes. In other words, all of us who grew up playing APBA grew up playing basically the same game. But of course, we've got to go back in time to tell this story. J. Richard Seitz loved playing a game called National Pastime when he was a kid. National Pastime was a variant of the old dice baseball games, but with a twist. It included individual cards representing individual players and was the first of its kind. Well, at least this was the first of its kind that we know of. National Pastime was published in 1930, and it predated Ethan Allen's spinner game All-Star Baseball by over a decade. If anybody beat Clifford Van Beek and his National Pastime to the punch, it's so obscure that nobody knows about it. Well, Seitz and his friends loved playing National Pastime. In fact, they loved it so much that they formed their own league, the American Professional Baseball Association, or APBA. Seitz was fascinated with printing and created things like membership cards. There were also ribbons for league winners, so this was serious stuff. But of course, Seitz eventually grew up. His neighborhood league started in his early teens and lasted until he went to college. And the funny thing is that the company that made National Pastime went out of business not long after they started. Seitz and his friends wanted to get new cards, but there was no company to buy them from, so they did the obvious thing. These are photocopies of some of the original J. Richard Seitz National Pastime homebrew cards. It's not clear what year these cards were made. I suspect that he used existing National Pastime cards and made a few changes to a few result numbers to get them to represent new players. While I'm still slowly doing research on those cards, hopefully I'll have something a little bit more definitive before too long. Anyway, Seitz loved the game so much that he took it with him everywhere, even to the military. And changes in his career and getting married didn't deter his interest in the game. He kept making cards and he kept tinkering around with it. In 1951, Seitz decided to go into the baseball game business, calling his company APBA after the old league, of course. Okay, we should stop here because I get comments all the time from people who want to know why I call it APBA and not APBA. The answer is that Seitz told us to. Well, if you look at the real old advertisements, you'll see it. Here it is, pronounce it APBA. In the pre-internet age, advertisements like this were kind of like dictates from on high. Nobody really questioned where that name APBA came from. Even after National Pastime was discovered and revealed in the mid-1970s, nobody asked anything about where that odd word APBA actually came from. It wasn't until January 1997, almost 5 full years after Seitz passed away, that we learned that it came from his old neighborhood draft league. That's the sort of power that the Seitz mystique has held over the community. Anyway, the first version of APBA was a lot like National Pastime, except with 2 major differences. The first difference was the pitching system. This was pretty simple. There were 4 grades in all of which determined how well pitchers could stop singles. A-graded pitchers could stop a whole bunch of stuff from happening. B-graded pitchers were almost as good, but not quite. C-graded pitchers were just a little bit worse than average. And D-graded pitchers couldn't do anything to stop the onslaught of base hits. The second system was the fielding system. Every player was given a numerical rating indicative of their fielding abilities. The rating of each infielder was given according to a specific scale, and you would get a team fielding rating when you added together each individual's fielding score. That would give you one of 3 fielding indexes, commonly known as Fielding 1, Fielding 2, and Fielding 3. A Fielding 1 team would stop all sorts of balls from getting through. A Fielding 3 team, on the other hand, was prone to all sorts of errors and infield hits. Well, some people claim, sort of cynically, that Seitz made minimal changes to National Pastime when he put APBA out. That's not true. There were major changes to this game. In fact, no game before APBA had a pitching system at all. Ethan Allen's game used a spinner system to look for results, but only on the batter's discs. Pitchers were hopeless to stop them. And the truth is that pitching and fielding systems in APBA worked together to determine how good or how bad a pitcher was. It might sound odd to say this today, but Seitz was actually ahead of his time. Seitz understood that there was a team component to defense and also understood that pitching and team defense were closely tied together. That's not to say that Seitz was some sabermetric genius. He got a lot of things wrong, sure. However, he certainly was conceptually ahead of the rest of baseball analysis in the early 1950s, and that's one of the reasons why APBA was so successful. But I should note that APBA was not a smash hit from the start. 137 of those original APBA games were printed, 135 sold. The truth is that back in those days, APBA lost money. In fact, it lost money for its first few years, but Seitz kept at it. The old story is that Seitz and his wife worked nights and weekends filling orders for the new game. This was the old days, back when the APBA headquarters were at 118 East James Street, which happened to be the old Seitz family home. And yeah, this means that the game was literally made on his kitchen table. And Seitz kept tinkering with his game too. One thing we forget about when we talk about how APBA was different from National Pastime is the old sacrifice booklet. You see, in National Pastime, bunting was determined by certain play results, 36 through 40 to be exact. These numbers were set up to almost never count as an at-bat and were bunts in almost every situation. And that's a problem, of course. Sometimes you don't want to bunt. If you're going to be the manager, you want to actually be in charge, right? You don't want players to bunt with 2 outs or to bunt when you're down by 11. Well, Seitz fixed all of that. The sacrifice booklet, which contains results that are quite different from the normal boards, is rarely seriously studied. Well, in 1952, Seitz combined that sacrifice booklet with a hit and run option, at first only with a runner on first base. The familiar hit and run with runners on first and third was only added to the booklet in 1956. Also, in 1952, Seitz removed the old hit by pitch result for play result number 23 with the bases empty. Stuff like that might sound kind of trivial, but is actually kind of important, especially when it comes to playing with the really old cards. The rule of thumb is that you need to have a copy of the boards that were being sold when your cards were first being sold. Otherwise, you can get some kind of odd results. Anyway, the next really big change came in 1957. That's when APBA introduced the additional pitching ratings. A W means that the pitcher gives up walks in a lot of situations. It's W for wild. A Z is the opposite of the W. It means that the pitcher doesn't give up walks in certain situations. These are mostly situations where first base is already occupied, and the interesting thing is that it's actually realistic, though I'm not so sure that Seitz knew that. As you might know, you can find situation-specific pitching splits on Baseball Reference for most seasons. I looked at a few random seasons from different eras, and it turns out that walks have always been more rare with first base occupied. This was true in 1919. This was also true in 2009. There's also some evidence that the National Pastime and the APBA approach of having different results depending on different base situations might be more accurate. So it turns out, for example, that hitters hit a lot better with a runner on third base, but I'm getting off the subject. An X rating meant that the pitcher was very good at striking batters out and would get extra strikeouts as a result. A Y meant that he would get a few more strikeouts than normal, but not as many as a pitcher with an X. And of course, there was also the XY rating, which meant that the pitcher was an elite strikeout artist. The way that Seitz designed all of these modifications was a sort of an overlay on top of National Pastime. For example, in some situations, a ground ball would turn into a strikeout with the right ratings. In other situations, a pop fly would become a strikeout. Sometimes a double play would turn into a walk. The special pitching symbols would always take precedence over what the boards originally said. Now, the same thing was true of the running symbols. Some players received an F, meaning they were fast. Others received an S, meaning that they were slow. Sometimes a fast runner would take an extra base. Other times a slow runner would be thrown out on the base paths. And then Seitz made changes to the fielding column so that individual fielder ratings made more of a difference. This started in 1956, so the original wording was a little bit confusing. By 1958, Seitz had developed the modern optional fielding system that we all know and love, complete with the infield fielding ratings and this chart. Now notice that these changes were always appended to the board, sort of stuck on top of the old National Pastime system. There was no extra dice roll requirement, the results just happened. That was by design. You see, in all of his extensive playtesting over years, Seitz knew for a fact that the reason National Pastime worked so well is because the game could be played so quickly, and he certainly didn't want to mess around with how quickly the game was played. Well, not until 1959, that is. In 1959, Seitz created the double column card. It's pretty simple. If you roll a 0 in the first column, the column to the left, you roll again and look at the second column, the one to the right. This allowed Seitz to have a bit more control over how extra base hits were divided for certain hitters. But of course, this meant that more plate appearances would need more than one dice roll to resolve. That was a trade-off that Seitz was certainly really reluctant to make. In fact, Seitz preferred to give power hitters single-column cards. He would generally save the double-column cards for the lesser hitters, a trend that I think continues to this day. Now, there is a question about why Seitz decided to suddenly rush out the double-column system in 1959. I don't know the answer for sure, but I strongly suspect that he did this because of competition in the baseball sim market. The first version of Ballpark Baseball, which is a pretty obscure game, was reportedly released in 1957. Big League Manager followed in 1958, and then came Nagamco in 1959. So we could argue about just how effective those games were. Big League Manager and Nagamco both featured a spinner instead of dice, and they were really complex. Ballpark changed a lot over the decades, and it really isn't all that well documented, so it's kind of hard to compare. What we do know, though, is that Seitz paid very close attention to the market for tabletop baseball games. In fact, when he passed away, his estate included a large number of old games made by old and other companies. This included some games that were actually really rare. He was a businessman first and foremost, and he knew his competition. Anyway, that brings us to 1960, which is the year that the APBA boards were pretty much set in stone. Sure, you can still find some examples of board tinkering, but they're generally minor. For example, APBA's first pitcher grade reduction rule had pitchers losing a grade for giving up 6 earned runs within 3 consecutive innings. That rule started in 1954. Seitz changed this to 5 runs in 1960. 1954 was also the first year of APBA's famous grade advancement system, where pitchers would actually get better if they managed not to give up any earned runs in a certain period of time. Now, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that APBA is still the only game on the market that has pitchers get better over time. I guess it's technically an optional rule, but most of us use it. Additionally, 1960 saw play result 22 with a runner on first change to a hit by pitch. And after that, there were basically no changes. Seitz decided to create play result number 42 in 1972 after a suggestion by future replay baseball founders John Brodak and Norm Roth. A 42 always means that the batter was hit by the pitch, no matter what the situation is. This was necessary because of Ron Hunt, who was notorious in the early 1970s for being hit by the pitch. However, Seitz didn't bother to add the 42 to the playing boards until 1977. The same goes for the 14 with an asterisk after it, which meant an automatic stolen base. This innovation came about in 1975 to deal with Lou Brock's 1974 card. Again, this wasn't listed on the playing boards until 1977. In fact, APBA continued to write those special results in fine print at the bottom of cards until 1986. Well, because of that lack of significant change to the boards over decades, APBA started to feel like a game that had simply never changed. And of course, the lack of changes coincided with the greatest period of APBA's popularity. The vast majority of playing boards that you'll find on eBay come from that 1960 to 1995 period. There are a couple of other trivial changes that came place, for example the ZZ rating, which was added in 1990 because of Dennis Eckersley. However, the next major change to the boards came in 1995 as part of a rebranding effort. Somebody at APBA headquarters decided that kids would like the game better if the results were written like they came from a radio broadcast. I suppose that part of that came from the success of APBA's Baseball for Windows, which we'll talk about later. However, on tabletop the execution was just awful. Well, here are a few examples from those boards. Plunked in the ribs, take your base, batter takes first. Scorched, what a diving grab by first baseman, robbery. Lined into right field gap, looks like trouble, caught, he gets wow, it in, this is going to be a triple play. Blooped, right fielder dives, no, skips away, it's going to be a triple. Anyway, I could go on. Needless to say, these boards were not popular with anybody. It was an idea, I guess, but it was not very well executed, and it happened to coincide with one of the darkest periods in APBA's history. And that brings us up to 1999 and the first booklet. It's been mostly smooth sailing ever since then. The K and R strikeout symbols were added in 2005, but that's really about it. And, well, APBA is running out of letters to use for special pitcher actions. Anyway, to remind myself of this game, I decided to use the classic version of the boards and play with the so-called 1955 R set, which was first released in 1991. Well, when I was 7 or 8 years old, I really wanted a copy of this 1955 season, and that shows you what my childhood was like. I got it for Christmas one of those years. Well, sadly, I had to sell that old set years back. However, I was recently able to purchase another copy, and so I decided to play the 1955 World Series to prepare for this video. Now, you'll probably wonder how in the world Whitey Ford and Bob Turley could both receive A grades. Ford went 18-7 in 1955 with a 2.63 ERA and absolutely dominated hitters. Turley went 17-13 with a 3.06 ERA. But look more closely at the cards. You'll see that Turley has that W, which is a huge liability. And of course, Turley did lead the American League in walks in 1955, giving up 177 in 246 2/3 innings. Well, critics of APBA will point out that there are only 4 pitching grades. However, if you've played a lot of APBA, you know that there is a difference between a pitcher with an AY rating and one with an AXW rating. In my World Series, however, Ford and Turley actually did pitch differently. Ford lost a 2-1 game in 11 innings in Game 1. Turley followed it up with a 6-2 victory in Game 2. When Ford pitched Game 4, he was masterful, giving up only 1 hit and winning 4-1. Then, however, Turley pitched 12 innings in Game 5, losing 3-2. Turley struck out 16 in those 12 innings, but also gave up 10 walks. And the Dodgers won my APBA World Series in 6 games. So, as you can see, Turley's wildness really cost him an APBA. In other words, the APBA system works better than you might think at first glance. But, of course, that doesn't mean that the criticisms of the pitching system are invalid. In fact, back in 1958, Seitz created a new pitching grade from scratch, the A and C, which he gave to Grover Cleveland Alexander of the 1915 Phillies. So the 1915 Phillies were one of several great teams of the past that Seitz created back in those days as an additional source of revenue. Alexander was the first of his kind, and I'm pretty sure that there was a little card that came with the team explaining how the A and C worked. Basically, Alexander would be an A pitcher unless the A pitcher gave up a hit, at which point he would become a C pitcher, unless, of course, the C pitcher also gave up the hit. It was sort of like having a super A grade. It wasn't until 1966 that an explanation for this grade showed up on the APBA boards. There's also such a thing as an A and B pitcher, like the current card for Bob Gibson's 1968 season, though this grade is even rarer. Gibson's original 1968 card was an A and C, of course. And as the APBA blog explains, the difference between the two is actually pretty small. But there's still a difference, and we should think about APBA having 6 pitching grades, not just 4. Of course, part of the joy of APBA lies in debates like this. What grade should this pitcher get? Is this grade really different from that one? And so on. In fact, APBA is probably more open to innovations and changes than any other tabletop baseball sim. Part of this is because of how simple the game's design is. Part is also because of problems the game company has historically had with inaccurate pitcher ratings. It's pretty common to find people who regrade pitchers and use house rules to modify things a little bit. In fact, there are even alternative playing boards that have come up over the years. Of course, the game company has improved its card creating procedures over time. Now, the one thing that really stood out to me as I played APBA again was just how easy it is to play the game. It plays quickly, too. Now, I've played National Pastime, I've played the original 1951 version of APBA, and now I replayed the APBA that I grew up with, and my average length of game for all 3 variants was still under 20 minutes per game. Older players tend to like the speed with which you can play APBA. It means completing projects is actually doable. Of course, the easy-to-read text also helps. And above all, it's still a fun game, even though it feels kind of simplistic at times. And it's unrivaled in season availability. APBA currently also offers all players for most of its past seasons, though not all. It's also relatively easy to find old seasons on eBay, though prices have been slowly increasing. Anyway, there you have it. APBA's basic game has been around in its current form for almost 75 years now. I don't see any signs of it stopping. In fact, if anything, I think it will likely grow in popularity, provided that the game company finally figures out how to advertise to a younger market. It will take a few years for the game company to catch on, but believe me when I say that this game is not going anywhere anytime soon. So give it a try if you haven't yet, or if it's been a long time, you might want to give it another try. It's a better game than you might think.